Have you ever wondered what secrets lie behind the closed doors of the buildings we pass every day? What stories hide in the quietest corners, out of sight from those who measure life only by bank statements and success? I ask because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about money or property, but about a moment that changed everything. A moment that reminds us the value of a life can't be measured in dollars. That day, Jonathan Hale was on a mission. He'd come to collect overdue rent from tenants in one of his lower-end apartment blocks, the kind of building that was supposed to be an investment in an up-and-coming neighborhood. At least that's what his partners at the real estate firm called it. The world knew him as a millionaire. Sharp, direct, always dressed to the nines, but he wasn't prepared for what waited behind apartment 4B. The hallway was dim and smelled faintly of detergent and old dreams. As he knocked, he was already annoyed. Another family behind on payments, another name on a spreadsheet. But when the door creaked open, Jonathan froze. Inside, a black girl, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger, was hunched over a battered sewing machine. Her hands moved with nervous skill, fingers wrapped in bandages, her face pinched with exhaustion. The air in the room was heavy and thick with quiet effort, as if every inch of space carried the weight of something unspoken. Piles of colorful fabric were stacked with careful pride in the corners, offering the only brightness in a home otherwise marked by want. She looked up at Jonathan with a steadiness that unsettled him. "My mom's sleeping," she said in a voice that was soft but not afraid. "Can I help you?" For a second, he felt like an intruder. His expensive suit, his shiny shoes, all of it seemed absurdly out of place. He coughed, tugged at his collar. "I'm here for the rent," he managed, suddenly unsure of his own authority. "You're late." The girl didn't flinch. She stopped the sewing machine, wiped her hands on a piece of cloth, and walked over to a small box. She pulled out a crumpled envelope and handed it to him. "It's half," she explained. "The rest is coming when I finish these dresses for Mrs. Klein down the hall." Jonathan stared at the envelope, then at the girl's hands, calloused, small, but determined. He'd grown up in mansions, surrounded by staff, never worried about rent or food or anything beyond his next vacation. To see a child working with this kind of purpose, he couldn't make sense of it. "Shouldn't you be in school?" he asked, more gently than he meant. She shrugged. "Mom says work comes first right now. She's sick. I help." From the back room came a rough, rattling cough. The girl didn't startle. She only looked toward the door, then turned back to her sewing. "My name's Amara Williams," she said. "You can tell my mom we're doing our best." He nodded, oddly humbled. As he left, Jonathan found himself pausing outside the door, the envelope of worn bills in his hand. The numbers, the spreadsheets, the business plans. Suddenly, none of it seemed quite so important. Driving away in his sleek black Mercedes, he caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, he felt a discomfort he couldn't name, a crack in the armor of his routine. Was this really the world he'd built for himself? A world where a little girl's survival depended on how fast she could sew and how much she could endure? The next morning, in his glass-walled office high above the city, the memory of Amara's tired face lingered. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from partners, messages about returns on investment, urgent reminders about the quarterly earnings report. But none of it seemed real. He kept thinking of that apartment, the fabric scraps, the little hands bandaged with makeshift gauze. And then 2 days later came the call that would unravel everything. "Mr. Hale, this is Mercy General Hospital. We have a patient, Celeste Williams. You're listed as the emergency contact by her daughter." The nurse's voice was brisk, businesslike. Jonathan blinked in confusion. I think you have the wrong number." "No, sir. Her daughter insisted. She said you own their building." Within an hour, Jonathan was standing at the hospital reception, feeling completely unprepared. He found Amara alone on a hard plastic chair, clutching a ragged backpack, her eyes red from crying, but her posture as dignified as ever. "They won't let me see her," she said when she saw him. "They say I'm too young to be in the room alone, and I don't have any other grown-ups to call. You're the landlord, so I put your name down." The simplicity of her logic stunned him. To Amara, the landlord was the only authority left to trust. While they waited, Jonathan asked quiet questions. He learned that Celeste, Amara's mother, had been sewing from home ever since her illness worsened. Amara had picked up sewing by watching, by practicing, by necessity. She handled payments, kept the house together, and negotiated with clients all by herself. She was, in every sense, her family's backbone. And as the day wore on, Jonathan realized something. This was no ordinary tenant, and this was no ordinary encounter. His world, clean, cold, calculated, was about to be upended by the quiet courage of a child who should have never had to grow up so fast. Let me pause here and say, if you've ever walked past a neighbor and wondered what story their silence holds, you're not alone. We're all guilty of missing the people right in front of us. What happened next showed me that a single act of seeing someone, really seeing them, can shake a life to its foundation. If you're curious to know how a millionaire's visit to collect rent led to the unraveling of secrets, the clash of privilege and perseverance, and the discovery of a bond that would change two families forever, keep watching. What happened next is something I'll never forget, and I promise it will leave you thinking about your own life a little differently too. Jonathan spent most of that night pacing the halls of Mercy General, the hard glow of fluorescent lights echoing his unease. He could hear Amara's quiet voice behind him at times, asking nurses about her mother, always polite, never pleading. When at last a doctor emerged with tired eyes and a clipboard, Jonathan braced himself for the worst. "Celeste Williams," the doctor said, voice low. "Severe pneumonia, complicated by untreated tuberculosis. She'll need to be here at least 3 weeks, and then home care." Jonathan nodded, but before he could ask what came next, Amara stepped forward, her chin lifted, her words controlled. "What about me? Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "Immediate family only in the ICU and, well, someone from Child Protective Services will be in touch. Do you have another relative, Amara?" Amara shook her head, hands fisted at her sides. Jonathan saw her steel herself in the space between heartbeats. "She has me," he blurted out, surprising himself. "I'm her, uncle. I'm here for her." It was a lie, but somehow it felt more honest than anything else he'd ever said in that cold, glittering office of his. They let them in, but only for a moment. Celeste lay small and silent under the sheets, machines hissing and whirring at her side. Amara pressed her hand to her mother's and whispered, "I'll finish the dresses, Mama." I promise. Jonathan watched her, his own heart twisting. He'd never seen such loyalty, such love compressed into so small a body. But the real trouble started in the hallway. A stern woman with tired eyes and a badge approached. Ms. Diane Rivers, Child Protective Services. "Amara, we need to talk about where you'll stay while your mother's in the hospital. The state can't leave you alone in the apartment." Panic flickered across Amara's face, and Jonathan felt it like a jolt. "She'll stay with me," he said, this time louder, more confident. "I own the building. I can take responsibility. At least until her mother's home." Diane Rivers looked him up and down, her skepticism plain. "That's highly unusual, Mr. Hale. We'd need legal documentation, a court order even. Are you prepared for that?" "I'll get it," he replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. What happened next still feels unreal to me. In less than 48 hours, Jonathan found himself plunged into a world he'd never known. Suddenly, his polished penthouse, always so pristine, so empty, had the gentle chaos of childhood in it. Amara insisted on sleeping on the living room couch, not wanting a fancy bedroom far from the phone in case the hospital called. She kept to herself, sewing quietly in the mornings, always checking her bandaged hands before starting, always speaking in the kind of adult sentences that make you realize how many children have had their childhood stolen from them by necessity. "You can choose any room you want," Jonathan offered one afternoon, after a particularly exhausting call with his lawyer about the temporary custody hearing. "I'd rather stay by the phone," she replied simply. "I don't like big rooms." He watched her sometimes, caught off guard by her self-sufficiency. She'd make toast for breakfast, clean up after herself, even fold his expensive suits more carefully than he ever did. But underneath her calm, Jonathan saw the exhaustion. The late nights sewing by the kitchen window, the way she winced when her hands cramped, the silent tears she'd quickly brush away before anyone could notice. And all the while he felt a growing sense of responsibility. A weight, yes, but also something that felt a little like hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could do something right. The next day, they met with Diane Rivers and his lawyer, Martin Kell. Martin was blunt. Jonathan, you've never even babysat before. Social services doesn't just hand over kids to single men with no parenting record, even if you're a millionaire. Jonathan swallowed. I'm not asking to be her parent forever. I'm just helping. The alternative is a shelter. She's already lost enough. The social worker eyed Amara. Is this what you want? She asked gently. Amara nodded. Mr. Hale lets me work. If I go to a foster home, I can't sew, and then we can't pay rent. I need to help my mom. Diane sighed, jotting something down. It's unconventional, but I'll allow temporary custody, pending a full review. But Mr. Hale, if there's the slightest concern, she'll be removed immediately. Amara's relief was visible, but so was her wariness. That night she left her sewing for just a moment and quietly placed a folded piece of paper on Jonathan's desk. For you, she said. Inside was a note in careful script. Thank you for helping my mother and me. I know you don't have to. I'll do my best not to be any trouble. If you ever need anything sewn, just ask. I'm good at repairs. Jonathan smiled at that. Sometimes the smallest acts of gratitude break open the hardest hearts. But the outside world wasn't so easily swayed. At the headquarters of Hale Properties, not everyone was happy with Jonathan's sudden attention to a single tenant. Behind the scenes, his rival on the board, Veronica Chen, watched closely. She'd always seen Jonathan as a threat. Too soft, too unpredictable, not ruthless enough to climb to the top. She began keeping tabs, quietly gathering photos and rumors. One evening, Jonathan returned home to find Amara at the kitchen table, not sewing, but hunched over a stack of papers and newspaper clippings. She looked up. Can I ask you something? Anything, he said. Why do you own so many buildings? She asked, voice plain. And why do people like us always end up in the oldest ones? It stung, because he didn't have an answer that would make sense to a child who saw her home as a lifeline, not an asset. He tried to explain gentrification, investment, opportunity, but in the end, all he could offer was a quiet, "You deserve better." Amara gave him a small, tired smile. I know, but I'm used to making things work, even if they're broken. He sat with her then, just two people lost in a city too busy to notice either of them. For the first time, Jonathan saw how much he'd missed by living life at a distance, how many stories he'd ignored behind every closed door. It's strange how quickly a child can change you. You go in thinking you're helping them, but you end up learning more about yourself than you ever wanted to. I couldn't help but reflect as I watched their uneasy truce become something softer. Sometimes it takes someone else's pain to make you face your own, and all the while Amara kept sewing. Dresses, curtains, patches for neighbors. Each night she'd rest her head on the arm of the couch, exhausted, but somehow still determined. The apartment was cleaner, quieter, but filled now with something neither of them had dared hope for, the slow, delicate possibility of trust. But outside the storm was gathering. Veronica was moving, and neither Jonathan nor Amara knew just how high the stakes would soon become. It's funny how quickly a new kind of routine can feel like home, even in the most unlikely places. By the second week, Jonathan and Amara had settled into a strange, delicate rhythm. Each morning he'd make toast and eggs, clumsy, half-burnt, but always appreciated. Each afternoon, Amara would sit by the living room window, her sewing machine purring quietly, sunlight warming her shoulders. She'd finish hems for Mrs. Gibbons downstairs, patch up shirts for neighbors, even start a quilt from leftover fabric scraps. Sometimes Jonathan would watch her, marveling at how something so small could hold a whole life together. Yet just beneath the surface, he felt tension rising, a pulse of unease that wouldn't go away. Calls from his office came more frequently, questions about his distraction from senior partners, polite but pointed reminders that his responsibilities to the company outweighed personal charity cases. And at night, when the apartment was silent except for the ticking of the ancient wall clock, Jonathan would lie awake, thinking of Celeste in the hospital, of Amara's quiet resilience, and of his own family's secrets, things he'd never had to face until now. One cold Thursday morning, The tension finally broke. Amara was sitting at the table, bent over a notebook, when Jonathan's phone rang, an urgent summons to an emergency board meeting. He could tell by the clipped tone of his secretary that it was trouble. He knelt beside Amara, voice gentle. I need to go to my office for a few hours. Will you be all right here? She nodded, not looking up. I'll be fine. Just don't forget to call the hospital, please. He promised, squeezing her shoulder, and left with a heart that felt heavier than ever. Downtown, the air in the glass-walled boardroom was sharp with accusation. Veronica Chen stood at the head of the table, her expression icy with satisfaction. Projected onto the screen behind her were photos. Jonathan leaving social services with Amara, helping her into his car, carrying groceries with her. Veronica's voice was slick, practiced. Colleagues, I must raise a concern. Our CEO is engaging in highly questionable behavior, housing a minor with no legal connection, risking the company's reputation, possibly even endangering her. The murmurs around the table grew uneasy. Jonathan felt the old familiar pressure, his father's voice in his head. Don't get sentimental, son. The world will eat you alive. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He opened his laptop, eyes never leaving Veronica's. Before you pass judgment, he said, I want to share something I recently discovered. He tapped the keyboard, and on the screen appeared a scan of an old contract, yellowed, faded, but unmistakable. It bore the signatures of his father, Charles Hale, and a young Celeste Williams. This is the original employee agreement from the first building my father developed, Jonathan said, voice steady. It promised profit sharing to every staff member, housekeepers, doormen, seamstresses. Most never received a penny, including Celeste Williams. He flipped to the next page, an amended contract bearing Veronica's digital signature. But then the terms changed. The profit sharing was erased, and only a select few benefited. He glanced around the table, watching the discomfort settle over the room. Veronica was general counsel at the time. She orchestrated the change, signed off on the cuts, and buried the evidence. Veronica stood abruptly, outrage painted on her face. This is slander. Those are fabricated. Are they? Jonathan asked quietly. Because there are also emails, messages between you and my father, discussing exactly how to remove these obligations. Messages that, by the way, have already been sent to our legal department, the press, and the Department of Labor. The room exploded in whispers and shouts. Veronica's confidence drained away, replaced by panic. Senior partners stared at her and at Jonathan, as if seeing both of them for the first time. And all the while, Jonathan kept thinking of Amara, of her mother, of the hundreds of families like theirs who had been erased, ignored, shut out in silence. He realized then that this wasn't just about business. It was about reckoning. In the weeks that followed, the company convulsed. Veronica was forced to resign in disgrace, facing investigation for fraud and misconduct. News stories blazed with the headline, Hale Properties Scandal. Decades of broken promises to Black employees exposed. Stock prices wobbled, but public support, once cold, shifted as Jonathan announced the creation of a reparations fund for every affected family, and a permanent scholarship in Celeste Williams' name for children of color pursuing education in business, art, and design. All through this storm, Amara remained at his side. Celeste's conditions slowly improved. After a month, she was finally discharged, frail but fierce, determined to reclaim her life and her work. The day she returned home, Jonathan and Amara prepared her favorite meal, collard greens, cornbread, and a roast chicken donated by a grateful neighbor. As Celeste sat at the kitchen table, Amara placed a newly sewn quilt over her mother's shoulders, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Jonathan watched them, something in him softening and cracking at the same time. He knelt beside Celeste, his voice raw. I'm so sorry for what my family did, for all the years you were owed. I can't fix the past, but I promise you, I will spend my life making the future different. Celeste reached out and took his hand. You're already doing that, Jonathan. Just keep going. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The old building where Amara had grown up, once a symbol of neglect, was transformed. Jonathan funded the creation of a community arts center in the ground floor, complete with sewing machines, computers, and a classroom for local kids. Amara became its unofficial leader, teaching sewing and math to anyone who wanted to learn, her small fingers moving confidently over fabric and thread. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the windows, Jonathan sat beside Amara, helping her sort scraps for a new quilt. "You know," he said, "my father always taught me that money was the only thing that mattered. But I think maybe he was wrong." Amara looked up, eyes wise beyond her years. "Sometimes people only know what they're taught, but you can learn new things, Mr. Hale. You did." He smiled, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside. "You taught me, Amara." She grinned, threading a needle. "And you taught me not to be afraid to ask for help or to dream a little bigger." That night, as the city buzzed with distant lights and sirens, Jonathan watched over the people he'd come to love. Not as a landlord or a boss, or even as a savior, but as a man finally awake to the truth of his own heart. In the hush that comes just before sleep, he thought of all the bridges still to be built, all the wrongs still to be righted, and he knew that none of it would have happened without the quiet, relentless courage of a girl with tired eyes, a sewing machine, and a hope that refused to die. In a world so often blinded by power and profit, sometimes the smallest, most exhausted voice can change everything. Sometimes the ones who seem most powerless carry within them the blueprint for a new world, a world where dignity is restored and kindness is never wasted. And as dawn crept over the city, Jonathan Hale knew the story was only just beginning. Reflection. This isn't just a story about a millionaire and a girl with a sewing machine. It's about what happens when we finally see one another, when the powerful put down their shields and the vulnerable stand up, not just for themselves, but for everyone who comes after. If this story moved you, remember, real change isn't only in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the simple act of caring enough to knock on the right door and listening to the answer, no matter how quietly it's spoken. Let me know if you want the YouTube outro, meta, or any other enhancements for trending.